our Around the World segment tonight. Yesterday, President Trump and Vladimir Putin had a phone call. According to reports, the two discussed the ongoing conflict in Syria and agreed to a ceasefire. Tensions have been high between the two leaders after the Russian-backed Assad regime attacked its own citizens with chemical weapons. Joining me now, though, to discuss the phone call is former U.S. diplomat Jim Jatras. Jim, good to see you.
Good to see you again, Liz.
All right, Jim, talk to me about this phone call. I mean, it seems a bit odd to me that it came out just several weeks after the Assad regime, the Russian-backed Assad regime, perhaps attacked their own citizens with chemical weapons. What did Trump hope to achieve here?
Well, first off, I think your use of the word perhaps is quite appropriate, because I think that attack is still very questionable about what exactly happened here. I think what he hopes to achieve is to put back on track what he talked about during the campaign, which, if we are serious about targeting radical Islamic terrorism, there is no solution to the Syrian crisis and defeating the terrorists, not just ISIS, but also al-Qaeda and its allies, without working with the Russians.
Right, and how does this work? I mean, it's not the first time that this has been tried. The U.S. has tried to work with Russia in Syria before. We've even had ceasefires. They were broken. What makes this one different?
Well, to tell the truth, we have not tried working with the Russians in Syria. What we've done is simply tried to dictate to the Russians, we're going to have a regime change, Assad must go, there's nothing you can do about it, which in effect means a victory for some kind of jihad terrorist group, virtually the extermination of the Christian population in Syria, which is 99.9% pro-government, because the government protects them from the jihadists. And I think what we need to do now is listen, and presumably Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin can talk to each other about what should be a common concern, which is these jihadist groups supported by, let's be honest, the Saudis, Gulf states, the Turks, frankly, our allies.
Right, let me rephrase this then. Pretend for a second that we were on this phone call. I mean, how would that have gone? How would we actually work out a compromise? Or, like you said, how would President Trump listen to Vladimir Putin? What would the end result of that be? What would the solution look like?
Well, I think, as you pointed out in your initial question about a ceasefire, I think that would be part of it. Remember, we've had partial ceasefires, some of which did succeed. For example, around the time of the evacuation of Aleppo, East Aleppo, which had been held by some of the anti-government forces, and this was actually brokered by the Russians with the Iranians and the Turks to allow the government forces to re-enter East Aleppo, for the civilians that did not want to return to government control, and frankly for a lot of the fighters against the Syrian government to evacuate out and go to Idlib province, which is where they are now. It is possible to take small steps toward a comprehensive ceasefire, and hopefully after that to get some kind of peace talks going.
All right, well, let me ask you this. I mean, can they be trusted? I know President Trump said that our relations with Russia are at an all-time low since the Cold War, but frankly, Jim, I'm not sure they can be trusted. I mean, this is the same country that backed Assad. Whether or not you think that the chemical weapons happened by the Assad regime, I mean, Assad has been a dictator. He's been terrible to his people. This is the same nation, Russia, that has had submarines poised to cut our financial cables, our internet cables under the sea. This is the same country, Russia, that sent weapons to Iran. This is the same country, Russia, that disrupted, tried to influence our elections, you know, a threat to our democracy. Can we really trust them to uphold an end of a bargain?
I don't think anybody should trust anybody in international affairs. And if you talk to people on the Russian side, they don't have a whole lot of trust for us either. It's interesting, we have a worse relationship now with post-communist Russia than we did most of the time with the communist Soviet Union. It really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We do have a lot of interest in common. We should be focused on defeating the terrorists in Syria. Now, does that mean Assad, by comparison, is better? Yes, certainly. Assad is no threat to the United States. As I say, for the Christians of Syria, it's a matter of life and death, survival. That should be near the top of our agenda, it seems to me, and it hasn't been, certainly during the period of the last 6 years under the Obama administration, which was actively working for the victory of the jihadist forces.
No, I get that. And I mean, call me a skeptic here, but when you have a relationship that works, even between two competing countries, there has to be some level, even if it's just a grain of trust, for that to work. I don't know how the United States could put our men and women in harm's way, if that's what it came to, if we had to trust the Russians to do that. I guess I just don't understand. Maybe you can explain this to me more clearly, how this would actually play out in Syria.
Well, that's a good point that you raised right there, is putting our military personnel in harm's way in Syria. I don't think we should have military personnel in Syria right now. Believe it or not, we've got American Marines trying to protect the Kurds, our allies, from the Turks, our other allies. That's as incoherent as our policy has become now. We've got to get our eye on the ball. If our goal is to defeat radical Islamic terrorism, let's focus on that and not be thinking about 6 other things that are really not in the American national interest. And this is where I think what Donald Trump said about an America First policy, not being a policeman of the world, needs to make a comeback here. And I think, you know, for the first 100 days of his presidency, I think his foreign policies look more like a Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama policy. And I'd like to think, especially with what he said in Harrisburg this past week and taking on the media again, who praised him, by the way, after his strike on Syria, let's start to see the Donald Trump we saw during the campaign that puts our interests first.
Right. I get what you're saying. Let me just push back a second. Why do we need to compromise with the Russians then if the ultimate goal should be withdrawing, you know, hands-off approach in Syria? Why would we even need to compromise with them for a ceasefire if we are just wanting to get out of there?
Because when all's said and done, Syria is a vital national interest for the Russians. It is not for the United States. The only interest we have is to make sure that a jihad terrorist force does not come into power in Syria. And so far, as I say, for the last 6 years, our policy has been, to my mind, exactly to the opposite of the American national interest, which has been promoting these jihad forces against a secular, multi-ethnic, multi-religious government in Damascus, which to me makes no sense whatsoever. If the Russians' interest is to make sure that that government stays in power, that the jihadists are defeated, that the Christians are not killed, I don't see how that is contrary to our national interest.
Right, so translate that then. I understand what you're saying. I don't disagree with you. I understand what you're saying philosophically, but translate that to me, translate that for me into practical terms. How would that play out?
I think how it would play out is we understand that, you know, like it or not, Assad is not going anywhere. He is going to remain the president of Syria, that there is a very substantial portion of the Syrian population of all ethnic groups, all religious groups that want that because the alternative is far, far worse. We need to cooperate not only with the Russians, but we need to think about the other countries that have a dog in this fight in the region. You know, obviously, the Jordanians. To my mind, the real spoiler here are the Saudis and some of the Gulf states that are trying to make this into a sectarian war. I think we need to find, among other things, a way to rein in some of our regional allies that have been keeping this pot boiling for a very long time.
Right, and like you said, focus on the true enemy here. The enemy not just to us, but to Western nations and to Muslims also all over the world, and that's radical Islam. Jim, I appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks for being here.